This is not just the story of pharaohs, pyramids, or ancient wars. It is the story of a civilization that began before written history and survived long after foreign conquest. In this documentary, we will follow the entire timeline of ancient Egypt, from early Nile communities shaped by climate and survival, to the rise of the first kings, the age of pyramid power, and the collapse that changed everything. We will explore Egypt's silent golden age, the mystery of foreign rulers, the height of imperial power, and a bold religious revolution that failed. Finally, we arrive at Cleopatra, Rome, and an ending that was not truly the end. This is a journey through power, belief, and endurance. Let us begin with Chapter 1. Chapter 1. The origins of Egypt before the pharaohs. Long before pyramids rose above the desert, before kings carved their names into stone, the land that would become Egypt was already changing in quiet but powerful ways. The story begins not with pharaohs but with water, climate, and movement. Around 10,000 years ago, the region we now call the Sahara was not a sea of sand. It held grasslands, shallow lakes, and seasonal rivers. Rock art found across North Africa shows giraffes, cattle, and people hunting and herding. This was a living landscape, but it did not stay that way. Slow shifts in Earth's climate began to dry the region. Rains weakened, lakes shrank, grasslands faded. Over thousands of years, people were pushed toward one place that still offered life, the Nile River. This movement was not sudden. It happened generation by generation. Families followed water, camps became villages, villages stayed longer each year. By the time the Sahara fully dried, the Nile Valley had become a narrow ribbon of survival, pulling human groups into close contact. Archaeology gives us glimpses of these early Nile settlements, even though no writing exists from this time. Stone tools, hearths, storage pits, and animal bones show that people were fishing, hunting, and farming along the river as early as 7000 BC. These were not yet Egyptians in the way we imagine them, but they were laying the groundwork. Wheat and barley were grown, cattle were kept, seasonal floods were observed and remembered. Over time, people learned when the river would rise and when it would fall. This knowledge became power. One of the most important early sites is Nabta Playa, located far west of the Nile in what is now desert. Today it looks empty, but thousands of years ago it was a seasonal lake. Excavations there revealed stone circles aligned with the sun and stars, dated to around 6000 BC. These stones suggest organized planning, shared beliefs, and careful observation of the sky. There were also cattle burials placed with care, pointing to early ritual behavior. Nabta Playa shows that complex thinking existed long before temples or kings. It also raises questions. Who decided where these stones went? Who led these ceremonies? We see coordination, but no names. Closer to the Nile, evidence becomes richer. The Badarian culture, dated roughly between 4400 and 4000 BC, left behind finely made pottery, stone tools, and human burials. These graves were simple but meaningful. Bodies were placed on their sides, often facing west, the direction of the setting sun. Some were buried with personal items, like combs or beads. This suggests early ideas about identity and perhaps the afterlife. The pottery itself was carefully shaped and decorated, showing skill passed down over generations. What stands out is how quickly these communities became organized. Farming villages shared styles of tools and art across long distances. This means people were traveling, trading, and communicating. Copper objects began to appear, even though copper was not found locally in large amounts. It had to be brought in. Trade networks were forming. Along with goods, ideas traveled too. Symbols repeated. Burial practices became more similar. Slowly, culture was forming along the length of the Nile. At the same time, differences began to emerge between regions. Upper Egypt, in the south, had a narrow valley with strong river currents and fewer wide floodplains. Lower Egypt, in the north, opened into the delta, where the Nile split into many branches. These landscapes shaped daily life. In the south, settlements were closer together, and travel followed the river closely. In the north, communities spread out among wetlands and channels. Over time, these differences helped create two cultural zones, which would later be known as Upper and Lower Egypt. Leadership during this period is one of the biggest mysteries. There are signs of social ranking. Some graves are richer than others. Certain individuals were buried with more goods, better pottery, or imported materials. This suggests inequality and likely authority. But we do not yet see kings. There are no palaces, no royal tombs, no written laws. Power may have belonged to elders, clan leaders, or religious figures. It may have shifted depending on season, success in trade, or control of resources. What is clear is that religion was already taking shape. Early symbols linked animals, fertility, and natural forces. The river itself was central. Floods were not random disasters but life-giving events. Communities that could predict or manage them had an advantage. Over time, ritual and knowledge blended. Those who understood the rhythms of the Nile likely gained influence. This may be where spiritual authority and political power first crossed paths. The speed of this development is striking. In just a few thousand years, scattered groups became connected societies with shared customs, trade routes, and beliefs. This is the foundation of the origins of Egypt before the pharaohs. Yet much remains unseen. Wood decays, reeds vanish. Early houses were made of mud and plant material. Entire villages may have washed away in floods or been buried under later settlements. What we have is only a fraction. Still, even this fraction shows something important. Egyptian civilization did not appear suddenly with the first pharaoh. It grew slowly, shaped by climate pressure, river knowledge, and human cooperation. By the end of this early period, the Nile Valley was no longer just a place to survive. It was a place where power could grow, where symbols could last, and where the idea of rule was beginning to form. Chapter 2. The Unification Mystery of the First Pharaoh. By the time Egypt begins to speak to us through images and symbols, it does not whisper. It announces itself with power. Maces, crowns, enemies subdued beneath raised arms. This is where written history almost begins, and yet certainty is still out of reach. At the center of this moment stands a single figure, known today as Narmer, often called the first pharaoh of a united Egypt. But even here, at the very doorway of recorded time, the line between truth and story is already blurred. Around 3100 BC, the Nile Valley was no longer just a chain of farming communities. It had become a landscape of competition. Settlements grew larger, craft production increased, trade stretched farther. Most importantly, symbols of authority became more visible. Certain leaders began to stand apart. Their names, or at least their signs, appeared on pottery, seals, and stone objects. These marks were not decoration, they were claims of control. The most famous object from this period is the Narmer palette, discovered in the late 1800s at Hierakonpolis. Carved from dark stone and taller than a human forearm, it shows a king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt on one side and the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other. He strikes an enemy. He oversees decapitated bodies. Above him appears a falcon, a god linked to kingship. At first glance, the message seems clear. Egypt has been unified by force under one ruler. For decades, this image was taken almost literally. Narmer was seen as the conqueror, the man who ended division in a single decisive event. But archaeology rarely supports simple stories. As more sites were excavated, the picture grew more complicated. Evidence began to suggest that unification was not a single battle or moment, but a long process that unfolded over generations. Upper Egypt, centered around places like Naqada and Hierakonpolis, appears to have developed strong leadership earlier than the north. Cemeteries in the south contain larger tombs, richer goods, and clearer signs of hierarchy. In contrast, Lower Egypt's delta was harder to study. Wet conditions destroyed many early remains. Entire settlements may be lost beneath mud or modern development. This uneven evidence has shaped how the story is told. What we do see suggests growing southern influence pushing northward. Southern pottery styles appear in delta sites. Southern symbols spread. This could point to conquest, but it could also mean trade, marriage alliances, or gradual absorption. Power does not always arrive with armies. Sometimes it moves through control of resources, ritual authority, and shared belief. The Narmer palette itself may not be a historical record in the modern sense. Many scholars now view it as a ceremonial object, designed to present an ideal image of kingship. The enemies shown may not represent a specific battle. They may stand for chaos itself. The act of unification could be symbolic, showing what a king is meant to do, rather than what happened on a single day. This brings us to Menes, the name given by later Egyptian historians as the first king of Egypt. Menes appears in king lists written centuries after Narmer lived. Some scholars believe Menes and Narmer were the same person. Others think Menes may have been Narmer's successor, or even a title rather than a name. There is no inscription that clearly states Narmer is Menes. The link is inferred, built from fragments and later tradition. What makes this period especially challenging is how little writing survives. Early hieroglyphs existed, but they were not yet used for long texts. Most inscriptions are brief: a name, a symbol, a count. This means we do not have chronicles or explanations from the people themselves. Instead, we reconstruct events from objects, graves, and patterns. Despite this silence, signs of administration begin to appear. Seals used to mark containers suggest control over goods. Labels attached to jars record contents or origins. This hints at taxation, storage, and redistribution. A ruler who controls surplus controls loyalty. Grain, oil, and goods could support workers, soldiers, and specialists. This is the quiet machinery behind power. Violence, however, was still part of the picture. Mass graves, smashed skulls, and fortified settlements show that conflict was real. Kings did not rule by symbols alone. Their early state was fragile. Authority had to be demonstrated again and again. The imagery of domination carved into stone served a purpose. It reminded people who stood at the center. Religion played a key role in this process. The king was not just a leader, he was a mediator between humans and the gods. By presenting himself as chosen or protected by divine forces, a ruler made resistance not just rebellion, but disorder against the universe itself. This idea would become central to Egyptian thought for thousands of years. What makes the unification mystery so compelling is not that we lack evidence, but that the evidence speaks in layers. Myth and memory overlap with politics and power. Later Egyptians look back on this moment as the birth of their world. They simplified it. They gave it a name. But the ground beneath that story is uneven. By the end of this early dynastic phase, Egypt was clearly one kingdom, at least in idea. A single ruler stood at the top. Symbols were standardized. Writing was expanding. But the path to that point was likely messy, slow, and human. Not a clean victory, but a long negotiation between force, belief, and time. Chapter 3. The Old Kingdom and the Puzzle of Pyramid Power. By the time the Old Kingdom began, Egypt had crossed a quiet but critical line. The king was no longer just a powerful ruler. He was the center of the state itself. Around 2686 BC, the country entered a period of stability unlike anything seen before. Floods followed predictable patterns, harvests were strong, trade routes were secure, and at the top of it all stood a king whose authority reached into every village along the Nile. This is the moment when Egypt began to build in stone on a scale the world had never seen. The shift starts with King Djoser of the Third Dynasty. Before him, royal tombs were made of mud brick, large but temporary. Djoser changed that. At Saqqara, his architects stacked stone mastabas one atop another, creating the step pyramid. It was not just a tomb, it was a statement. Stone meant permanence. It meant the king's power was meant to last forever. Djoser's building project also tells us something important about how Egypt now functioned. This was not the work of slaves driven by fear. Excavations around pyramid sites show organized worker villages, bakeries, breweries, medical care, and regular food rations. These workers were farmers during flood season, when fields were underwater and labor was available. The state redirected that labor toward royal projects. This required planning, record-keeping, and trust in the system. Behind Djoser stood officials, scribes, and architects. One of them, Imhotep, is known by name, something rare for this early period. His titles show how power was distributed. The king ruled, but he ruled through a growing bureaucracy. Orders flowed down, goods flowed up. This system made the impossible seem routine. Over the next few generations, pyramid building accelerated. King Seneferu, founder of the Fourth Dynasty, built more than any other ruler. He experimented. The bent pyramid shows a change in angle halfway up, likely due to structural problems. Nearby, the red pyramid represents a solution, smoother and more stable. These structures reveal trial and error, not lost knowledge or sudden miracles. Engineers were learning by doing, refining techniques over decades. Then comes Khufu. His Great Pyramid at Giza remains the most powerful symbol of the Old Kingdom. Built around 2580 BC, it required millions of stone blocks, some weighing several tons. Quarry marks, tool traces, and transportation ramps show how this was achieved. Limestone was cut nearby. Granite was hauled from Aswan by boat. Ramps, sledges, and coordinated labor made movement possible. There is no evidence of advanced machines, only human organization at an extreme level. What allowed this was not technology, but control. The king claimed ownership of land, labor, and surplus. Taxes were paid in goods, not coins. Grain filled state storehouses. That grain fed workers, craftsmen, soldiers, and priests. Every successful flood strengthened the system. Every monument reinforced belief in it. Tombs of nobles from this time give us rare glimpses of daily life. Wall scenes show farming, fishing, cattle herding, and craft work. They also show officials overseeing activities, recording counts, and enforcing order. These images were idealized, but they reflect real structures. Society was layered but stable. People knew their roles. Religion supported everything. The king was seen as divine, the living embodiment of order. His burial was not private. It was a national event with cosmic meaning. If the king reached the afterlife safely, the universe remained balanced. If he failed, chaos threatened everyone. Building the pyramid was not just loyalty, it was survival. After Khufu, his son Khafre and later Menkaure continued building at Giza, though on slightly smaller scales. The pattern had been set. Pyramid building became the defining act of kingship. But even within this success, subtle changes were already underway. Pyramids began shrinking. Resources were stretched thinner. More officials claimed privileges once reserved for the king. Tombs of nobles grew larger and more decorated, reflecting rising local power. The centralized system still worked, but cracks were forming. By the end of the Old Kingdom, around 2181 BC, pyramid construction at this scale stopped almost entirely. Kings still built tombs, but nothing like before. The reasons were not sudden or mysterious. Climate records suggest lower Nile floods, leading to food shortages. Local governors became more independent. The cost of maintaining divine kingship grew too high. The puzzle of pyramid power is not how Egypt built them, but how long it could afford to. For a few centuries, everything aligned. Environment, belief, labor, and authority moved in the same direction. When one of those weakened, the entire structure followed. Chapter 4: Collapse of the Old Kingdom and the First Dark Age. The fall of the Old Kingdom did not arrive with fire or sudden invasion. It came quietly, stretched over decades, almost gentle at first. From the outside, Egypt still looked strong. Pyramids stood, temples functioned, the Nile still flowed. But beneath the surface, the system that once held everything together was slowly coming apart. By the late 6th dynasty, around 2200 BC, the king was no longer the unquestioned center of the world. Royal authority had weakened, not because people stopped believing in it, but because it had been spread too thin. For generations, pharaohs had rewarded loyal officials by granting them land, titles, and control over regions. These local governors, known later as nomarchs, began as servants of the crown. Over time, they became power centers of their own. In earlier centuries, officials were appointed and rotated. Now offices became hereditary. A son inherited his father's position. Tomb inscriptions from this period show local leaders boasting about feeding their people, protecting their towns, and acting independently. These were not acts of rebellion. They were signs that central power was no longer able to reach everywhere at once. At the same time, the environment was changing. Scientific studies of lake beds, soil layers, and ancient pollen point to a period of lower Nile floods. This was not a single year of bad harvest, but a pattern. When the flood was weak, crops failed. When crops failed, the state collected less surplus. Without surplus, workers could not be fed. Projects stopped. Temples struggled. The chain that connected the king to the people began to break. Later Egyptian texts describe this era as one of chaos and suffering. They speak of hunger, lawlessness, and violence. One famous text, often called the Admonitions, paints a picture of a world turned upside down, where the poor became rich and order collapsed. But historians approach these sources carefully. Most were written centuries later, during periods when strong kings wanted to justify their rule by comparing themselves to a dark past. Archaeology tells a more complex story. Some regions did suffer greatly. Mass burials suggest famine in certain areas. Graves became simpler, reflecting economic strain. Monument building slowed almost everywhere, but other regions appear stable, even prosperous. Local temples continued operating. Trade did not disappear. Life did not stop. It changed. For ordinary Egyptians, this period likely felt uneven. In one village, a strong local leader might organize food storage and protection. In another, people may have faced real hunger. Without a powerful central state, survival depended more on local conditions than national policy. This made Egypt less unified, but not necessarily unlivable. Religion also began to shift in subtle but important ways. During the Old Kingdom, the afterlife was closely tied to the king. Only the pharaoh was guaranteed eternal life among the gods. Others depended on their connection to him. Now inscriptions show new ideas spreading. Coffin texts, once reserved for royalty, appeared in non-royal burials. This suggests that access to the afterlife was becoming more personal, less dependent on the king. This change did not come from rebellion. It came from necessity. When central authority weakens, people look for meaning closer to home. Belief followed power, and power was now local. Egypt did not vanish during this first intermediate period. It fragmented. Rival centers emerged, especially in the north and south. Each claimed legitimacy, each honored the gods, each told its own version of history. This competition would eventually lead to reunification, but for now, Egypt existed as many Egypts. The mystery of this so-called Dark Age lies in how it has been remembered. Was it truly a collapse, or simply a shift away from extreme central control? Later rulers had reasons to exaggerate the suffering. Chaos makes strong kings look necessary. Order makes them look heroic. What we can say with confidence is that the age of pyramid power was over. The world that built monuments for eternity could no longer support itself in the same way. Yet Egypt endured. Its language, beliefs, and people adapted, quietly preparing for another transformation. Chapter 5. The Middle Kingdom and Egypt's Silent Golden Age. When Egypt came back together after generations of division, it did not announce its return with monuments meant to defy time. There were no pyramids rising suddenly from the desert, no claims that the king was a living god beyond question. Instead, the Middle Kingdom began quietly, almost carefully, as if Egypt itself had learned something from collapse. Around 2055 BC, a ruler from Thebes named Mentuhotep II succeeded in reunifying the land. His victory was not just military, it was political, symbolic, and deeply practical. Egypt was tired of fragmentation. Local rulers had proven they could keep people alive, but they could not create lasting unity. Mentuhotep's success marked the start of a new approach to kingship, one shaped by memory. The kings of the Middle Kingdom ruled differently from their Old Kingdom predecessors. They still held supreme power, but they no longer presented themselves as distant, perfect beings who stood above the world. Instead, inscriptions and texts describe kings as shepherds, caretakers, and protectors. They spoke openly about hardship, duty, and responsibility. This was not humility in the modern sense. It was strategy. A king who acknowledged struggle could claim legitimacy through service, not just divine status. One of the clearest signs of this shift appears in the written record. Unlike earlier periods, the Middle Kingdom left behind a large body of texts. Letters, administrative records, wisdom literature, and stories survive on papyrus and carved stone. These writings show a society deeply concerned with order, justice, and balance. They also show anxiety. Many texts warn against disorder, betrayal, and neglect of duty. The memory of the first intermediate period was still close. Administration became more structured and more controlled. Local governors were no longer allowed to grow independent without oversight. The crown tightened control over appointments and taxation. Officials were evaluated. Records were kept. Papyri reveal a state that watched itself closely, determined not to repeat past mistakes. This is one reason historians call this era Egypt's silent golden age. Its strength lay not in spectacle, but in systems. Engineering projects from this period reflect the same mindset. Instead of pyramids, the state invested heavily in infrastructure. Irrigation canals were dug and expanded, especially in the Fayum region. These projects allowed more land to be farmed and helped stabilize food production, even when floods were unpredictable. Control of water meant control of survival. The Middle Kingdom understood this deeply. Military campaigns also played a role. Egypt expanded south into Nubia, not just for territory but for resources. Gold mines, stone quarries, and trade routes were secured through forts and garrisons. These were not temporary raids, they were long-term investments. Inscriptions record supply deliveries, troop movements, and fort maintenance. The goal was stability, not glory. Daily life during this time appears relatively prosperous for many people. Tomb scenes show agricultural abundance, craftwork, and family life. Burials became more common across social levels, suggesting broader access to wealth and religious belief. The afterlife was no longer the privilege of kings and elites alone. Coffin texts spread widely, offering spells and guidance to ordinary officials and their families. This continued the trend that began during the First Intermediate Period, but now within a stable state. Literature from the Middle Kingdom offers rare insight into how Egyptians thought about themselves. Stories like The Tale of the Shipwrecked Sailor and The Story of Sinuhe explore exile, loyalty, fear, and return. These are not religious texts. They are human stories, written with care and emotion. Their existence tells us that education, literacy, and reflection were valued. A society confident enough to tell stories is a society at ease with itself. And yet, for all this richness, the Middle Kingdom remains overshadowed. It does not dominate popular imagination the way the Old Kingdom does. There are no massive stone silhouettes burned into the horizon. Its monuments were often built of mud brick, not limestone. Many have eroded away. What survives is mostly written, not monumental. This creates a strange imbalance in how history remembers Egypt. The Pyramid Age looks eternal, but left fewer words behind. The Middle Kingdom spoke constantly, but built less that would last visually. It is easier to photograph stone than papyrus, easier to mythologize size than stability. The mystery of Egypt's silent golden age is not whether it existed, but why it feels invisible. It produced strong kings, efficient systems, powerful art, and lasting ideas. It held Egypt together for centuries. And yet, it often feels like a pause between more dramatic chapters. By the end of this period, signs of strain would begin to appear again. Borders grew harder to defend. Power shifted. But for now, Egypt had found a balance between authority and care, between memory and progress. Chapter 6. Foreign Rule and the Hyksos. Question. The Middle Kingdom did not end with a dramatic collapse. It thinned. Authority weakened at the edges first, then slowly at the center. By around 1800 BC, Egypt was once again facing pressures it had felt before, but this time the challenge did not come only from within. It came from people moving in from the outside, drawn by the same thing that had always attracted newcomers to the Nile: stability, food, and opportunity. In the eastern delta, the landscape was different from the rest of Egypt. It was wetter, more open to the Levant, and easier to enter by land. For centuries, people from the Near East had traveled into this region as traders, laborers, and settlers. Archaeology shows this clearly. Pottery styles, burial customs, and house layouts in delta sites reveal a mix of cultures long before any foreign rulers appeared. This movement was gradual, not sudden. Over time, these communities grew larger and more organized. One of the most important sites is Avaris, located in the northeastern delta. Excavations there reveal a thriving urban center with houses built in Near Eastern styles, imported goods, and evidence of active trade networks stretching into modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. This was not an isolated outpost. It was a connected city, deeply tied into regional exchange. The people who would later be called the Hyksos likely emerged from this environment. The word itself comes from an Egyptian term meaning rulers of foreign lands. It was not originally an ethnic label, it was a political one. Egyptian texts written later described the Hyksos as violent invaders who swept in and seized power. But the ground tells a quieter story. There is no clear archaeological layer showing widespread destruction across Egypt at the moment the Hyksos rose to power. No burned cities, no sudden breaks in daily life across the country. Instead, what we see is a shift in leadership in the north, while the south continued under Egyptian rulers based in Thebes. Egypt did not fall all at once. It divided again. The Hyksos kings adopted many Egyptian customs. They used royal titles. They worshipped Egyptian gods, especially Seth, whom they associated with their own storm deities. They wrote an Egyptian script. They ruled from within the system, not outside it. This suggests they were not trying to erase Egyptian identity, but to claim it. At the same time, they brought new elements into Egypt. Archaeology confirms the introduction of new military technologies during this period, including the horse-drawn chariot and the composite bow. These were not invented by the Hyksos, but they were introduced to Egypt through them. This would later have enormous consequences. Trade also expanded. Avaris became a major port and commercial hub. Goods moved through the delta at an increased scale. This period connected Egypt more deeply to the Eastern Mediterranean world. Far from being isolated, Egypt was now part of a wider system of exchange. For Egyptians living under Hyksos rule in the north, daily life may not have felt dramatically different. Fields were still farmed, temples still functioned. Records show continuity rather than disruption. The biggest change was likely political loyalty, not culture. The south, however, viewed the situation differently. The Theban rulers did not accept Hyksos authority. Over time, tension grew. Egyptian texts written after the Hyksos were expelled describe them as enemies, foreigners, and desecrators. These accounts shaped how history remembered the period, but they were written by the victors. Modern historians approach these texts with caution. They recognize that later Egyptian kings had strong reasons to paint the Hyksos as outsiders who disrupted order. Doing so made their own military campaigns appear necessary and heroic. It also reinforced a sense of Egyptian identity defined in contrast to the foreign other. The Hyksos question, then, is not simply who they were, but how they were remembered. Were they invaders, or were they part of a long process of migration and settlement that eventually reached political power? The evidence leans toward the second option, but the debate continues. What is certain is that this period forced Egypt to confront something new. For the first time, foreign rulers sat on Egyptian thrones in a meaningful way. Egyptian identity was tested, reshaped, and ultimately strengthened in response. By the end of this era, conflict between North and South would escalate. The Theban kings would adapt the very military tools introduced by the Hyksos and turn them against them. The struggle to reclaim Egypt would lead to a new kind of state, more outward-looking and more aggressive than before. Chapter 7: The New Kingdom and the Height of Imperial Egypt. When Egypt emerged from the Hyksos period, it did not simply return to old habits, it changed direction. The trauma of foreign rule had left a lasting mark on how Egyptians viewed the world beyond their borders. Security could no longer depend on isolation. Power had to be projected outward, not just defended at home. This shift marked the beginning of the New Kingdom, around 1550 BC, and it would transform Egypt into an empire. The early New Kingdom kings came from Thebes, the same southern city that had resisted Hyksos control. Ahmose I, the founder of the 18th dynasty, completed the expulsion of the Hyksos from the delta. Inscriptions describe campaigns, sieges, and the capture of enemy strongholds. But just as important as victory was what followed. Ahmose did not stop at reclaiming Egypt. He pushed into Nubia to the south and the Levant to the north, creating buffer zones that would keep threats far from the Nile. This was a new kind of thinking. Earlier, Egyptian rulers had defended borders when needed, but they rarely aimed for long-term control beyond them. The New Kingdom did. Garrisons were established, fortresses were maintained, tribute was demanded. Egypt was no longer just a kingdom along a river. It was becoming a regional power. One of the most remarkable rulers of this period was Hatshepsut. She came to power around 1479 BC, first as regent and then as king in her own right. Rather than rule quietly from behind the scenes, She took full royal titles and appeared in art wearing the symbols of kingship. Statues show her with a false beard and male regalia, not because she claimed to be male, but because kingship itself was defined in male terms. Hatshepsut's reign was marked less by war and more by trade and construction. Her most famous expedition was to the land of Punt, likely located along the Red Sea coast. Reliefs at her temple at Deir el-Bahri show ships returning with incense trees, gold, exotic animals, and luxury goods. These images are detailed and practical, showing Punt not as myth, but as a real place with real people. At the same time, Hatshepsut launched massive building projects. Her mortuary temple remains one of the most striking structures in Egypt. She restored temples damaged during earlier conflicts and emphasized continuity with tradition. Her rule suggests that imperial power did not always rely on constant warfare. Wealth, diplomacy, and religious legitimacy could also hold the empire together. After Hatshepsut's death, Egypt entered a more openly military phase. Thutmose III, often called Egypt's greatest warrior king, led numerous campaigns into the Levant. Inscriptions record battles, troop movements, and tribute lists. These texts show careful planning rather than reckless conquest. Egypt did not aim to destroy local rulers, it aimed to control them. Cities in Canaan and Syria were allowed to govern themselves as long as they paid tribute and remained loyal. Egyptian officials oversaw key locations. Hostages were sometimes taken and raised in Egypt, creating future allies shaped by Egyptian culture. This system relied on constant communication, which we can see clearly in surviving letters. The Amarna letters, written later but reflecting this system, show foreign rulers writing directly to the Egyptian king. They ask for gold, complain about rivals, and negotiate marriages. These letters reveal an empire held together by paperwork, relationships, and expectation, not just force. Egypt managed vast territories using messengers, scribes, and shared rules. Daily life within the empire varied widely. In Egypt itself, prosperity was visible. Temples employed thousands. Craftsmen worked on statues, jewelry, and reliefs. Villages like Deir el-Medina, home to royal tomb workers, show organized labor, wages, and even recorded strikes. People complained when supplies were late. This was a society where the state was deeply involved in everyday life. Under Ramses II, who ruled in the 13th century BC, the empire reached a peak of visibility. Ramses built on a scale meant to impress both Egyptians and foreigners. Temples, statues, and inscriptions bearing his name appear across the country. His reign was long, over 60 years, which itself created stability. Ramses' military campaigns, especially against the Hittites, are well documented. The Battle of Kadesh is one of the best recorded battles of the ancient world, described in Egyptian inscriptions and Hittite sources. While Ramses presented it as a great victory, modern historians see it as a strategic draw. What followed, however, was more important. Egypt and the Hittites signed one of the earliest known peace treaties. This agreement shows diplomacy at work on an international scale. For centuries, this imperial system functioned. Egypt balanced military force, economic wealth, and religious authority, but maintaining it required constant effort. Armies had to be supplied, borders had to be defended, temples demanded resources. Over time, strain increased. By the end of the New Kingdom, cracks would begin to show. External threats grew, internal power shifted. The balance that had sustained the empire became harder to maintain. Chapter 8. Akhenaten and the Religious Revolution. That failed by the time Akhenaten came to the throne. Egypt was wealthy, confident, and deeply religious. Temples dominated cities, priests held influence. The gods were everywhere, woven into daily life, politics, and identity. No one expected the system to change. That is what makes what happened next so striking. Akhenaten was born as Amenhotep IV, son of Amenhotep III, around the mid-14th century BC. His early reign looked ordinary. He honored the traditional gods and ruled from Thebes, the religious heart of the empire. But within a few years, signs of change appeared. One god, the Aten, a form of the sun disk, began to rise above the others in royal inscriptions. At first, this did not seem revolutionary. The sun had always been important in Egypt. What mattered was what followed. Akhenaten did not simply promote the Aten. He reduced the role of nearly every other god. Amun, the powerful deity of Thebes, lost royal support. Temple wealth was redirected. Priesthoods that had grown rich and influential were suddenly cut off from the king. Over time, images of traditional gods stopped appearing in official art. Only the Aten remained, shown as a sun disk whose rays ended in small hands reaching toward the royal family. This was not just theology, it was a direct challenge to the foundations of Egyptian power. Akhenaten soon took a dramatic step. He changed his name to mean effective for the Aten and founded a new capital city in the desert, halfway between Upper and Lower Egypt. He called it Akhenaten, Horizon of the Aten. Today we know it as Amarna. It was built quickly, using mud brick and simple stone, not meant to last forever. Boundary markers carved into the surrounding cliffs declare that this land belonged to the Aten alone. Archaeology at Amarna gives us an unusually clear picture of life during this experiment. Streets, houses, workshops, and palaces have been excavated. The city was laid out with purpose. Temples were open to the sky, allowing direct sunlight, unlike traditional dark sanctuaries. Art changed sharply. Figures became elongated. Faces looked softer, sometimes strange by earlier standards. The king and queen were shown touching, playing with their children, bathed in the rays of the Aten. This style was not random. It reflected the message of the new religion. The Aten was not represented as a human or animal. There were no myths, no family of gods, no hidden forms. The Aten was light itself, sustaining all life. Akhenaten presented himself not as a god, but as the only one who truly understood the Aten. Worship flowed through him. What scholars agree on is that Atenism was unlike anything Egypt had seen before. It reduced the divine world to a single focus and centralized religious authority in the king. What they debate is why Akhenaten did this. Some see political motive. By weakening the Amun priesthood, Akhenaten may have been reclaiming power for the crown. Others point to genuine belief. Hymns to the Aten, preserved on tomb walls, are poetic and deeply personal. They describe sunlight touching plants, animals, and people across the world. These texts suggest sincere devotion, not just strategy. There are also debates about Akhenaten himself. His unusual appearance in art has led to speculation about illness or mental state, but no physical evidence confirms this. Most historians now believe the art style was symbolic, not realistic. It emphasized difference, not deformity. While Akhenaten focused inward on religion, Egypt's empire continued to function, but with strain. The Amarna letters, clay tablets written by foreign rulers, show growing problems. Vassal kings complained about enemies, asked for troops, and begged for gold. Some messages went unanswered. Egypt did not collapse during Akhenaten's reign, but its grip loosened. Daily life for ordinary Egyptians under Atenism is harder to trace. Outside the new capital, traditional practices likely continued quietly. Archaeology suggests that Akhenaten's reforms were strongest where royal control was closest. Belief does not change overnight, especially when it has shaped life for centuries. After about 17 years, Akhenaten died. What followed was swift and telling. His successors moved quickly to undo his work. The capital was abandoned. Temples to the old gods were reopened. The name of the Aten was erased from monuments. Akhenaten's own name was hacked away. Later, king lists skipped him entirely. This was not a slow rejection. It was a deliberate erasure. The failure of Akhenaten's revolution raises difficult questions. Was it too extreme? Too fast? Too tied to one man? Egypt returned to its traditional gods, but it was not unchanged. The memory of this moment lingered, even if it was buried. Chapter 9. Decline, Invasions, and the Long Fall of Egypt. By the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt was still standing, but it was no longer unshakable. The great temples were active, rituals continued, and the Nile still followed its ancient rhythm. Yet beneath that familiar surface, power was slipping. Not in a single moment, and not everywhere at once, but gradually through choices made over generations. One of the clearest signs of change was where authority began to settle. During the height of empire, the pharaoh had balanced power with the military and the temples. Now that balance tilted, priests, especially those connected to major temples, grew increasingly influential. Land, labor, and wealth flowed into temple estates. In some regions, priests controlled more resources than royal officials. This did not break the state, but it reshaped it. Decisions became slower. Loyalties became divided. At the same time, Egypt's borders grew harder to manage. Maintaining control over distant territories required constant attention. Garrisons needed supplies. Allies needed reassurance. Enemies watched for weakness. As resources stretched thin, Egypt began to lose its grip beyond the Nile Valley. One by one, foreign territories slipped away. Trade routes narrowed. Tributes slowed. Inside Egypt, the royal line itself became unstable. Successions were shorter and less secure. Some kings ruled only a few years. Others faced challenges from rival claimants. This uncertainty weakened the idea of kingship that had once unified the country. When authority feels temporary, obedience becomes conditional. By around 1070 BC, the New Kingdom had effectively ended. What followed is often called the Third Intermediate Period. Though the name can be misleading, Egypt did not vanish. It changed shape again. Power fragmented between regional rulers, priestly authorities, and military leaders. In the Delta, leaders with Libyan ancestry rose to prominence. They adopted Egyptian titles, customs, and religious practices. They were not outsiders trying to destroy Egypt. They were part of its evolving society. These Libyan dynasties ruled large parts of the north, while the south remained closely tied to powerful temples. Egypt became a patchwork of overlapping authorities. Inscriptions from this time show rulers emphasizing their legitimacy through tradition, lineage, and devotion to the gods. The need to justify rule had returned. Further south, a new power was rising. Nubia, long connected to Egypt through trade and conflict, developed its own strong kingdoms. By the 8th century BC, Nubian kings moved north and took control of Egypt. They ruled as pharaohs, honoring Egyptian gods, restoring temples, and presenting themselves as renewers of tradition. Their reign is often called the 25th dynasty. From an Egyptian cultural perspective, this was not collapse. Art, language, and religion continued. Temples were repaired. Rituals were carefully observed. The Nubian kings saw themselves as protectors of Egypt's sacred order. But politically, Egypt was now vulnerable in ways it had not been before. This vulnerability became clear when a new force entered the picture. The Assyrian Empire, expanding aggressively across the Near East, turned its attention toward Egypt. Assyrian records describe campaigns into the Nile Valley, battles against Egyptian and Nubian forces, and the sack of major cities. Archaeology confirms destruction layers in some areas. For the first time in centuries, Egypt faced repeated large-scale invasions from a foreign power that did not seek to rule gently. The Assyrians did not stay long. Their interest was strategic, not cultural, but their attacks left deep scars. They exposed how divided Egypt had become. After their withdrawal, local Egyptian rulers regained control, but the sense of security was gone. In the centuries that followed, Egypt passed through several hands. Native dynasties attempted reform. Temples remained active. Priests recorded rituals, festivals, and donations. Life along the Nile continued, but outside forces returned again. In 525 BC, the Persian Empire conquered Egypt. Persian kings ruled as pharaohs, adopting Egyptian titles while governing from afar. Egyptian temples were allowed to function, but political independence was lost. Revolts broke out from time to time, some successful for brief periods, but none lasting. What is striking is how Egyptian culture endured through all of this. Language, art styles, religious beliefs, and social customs persisted. Foreign rulers often adopted Egyptian traditions rather than replacing them. To rule Egypt, one had to appear Egyptian. This raises the central mystery of this long decline. How could a civilization so strong in identity, belief, and tradition become so politically fragile? Part of the answer lies in scale. The empire that Egypt built required constant energy to maintain. When expansion stopped, strain followed. Another part lies in success itself. Powerful institutions like temples, once essential to stability, eventually competed with royal authority. Egypt did not fall like a tower. It settled, shifted, and adapted again and again. Political control changed hands, but the civilization beneath remained recognizable. Chapter 10. Cleopatra, Rome, and the End. that wasn't the end. By the time Cleopatra VII was born, Egypt had already been ruled by foreigners for nearly 3 centuries. The world she inherited was not the Egypt of pyramids and warrior pharaohs, but a land shaped by Greek language, Greek politics, and global trade. Yet beneath that surface, the deeper rhythms of Egypt still moved as they always had. Temples were active. Priests kept rituals alive. The Nile still defined time itself. What had changed was who sat at the top. The Ptolemaic dynasty began in the aftermath of Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt in 332 BC. After Alexander's death, his general Ptolemy seized control of the country and declared himself king. Unlike later invaders, the Ptolemies ruled Egypt as a Greek elite over an Egyptian majority. They spoke Greek, governed from Alexandria, and maintained Greek customs. At the same time, they presented themselves as pharaohs in temples, honoring Egyptian gods and traditions. This dual identity was not accidental. It was the key to survival. Alexandria became the heart of this new Egypt. It was a port city, a center of learning, and one of the richest cities in the Mediterranean. Grain from the Nile fed cities across the ancient world. Papyrus, glass, and luxury goods flowed through its harbors. The famous Library of Alexandria symbolized this age, collecting texts from across cultures. Egypt was no longer isolated. It was essential. But Ptolemaic rule was unstable. Family rivalries were constant. Brothers married sisters to preserve royal bloodlines. But this often led to conflict rather than unity. Assassinations, coups, and civil wars were common. Roman influence grew steadily as Egypt's rulers sought outside support to maintain power. Cleopatra VII came to the throne in 51 BC, at a time when Rome dominated the Mediterranean. Egypt was wealthy but vulnerable. Cleopatra was young, highly educated, and politically aware. Unlike many of her predecessors, she learned the Egyptian language. She presented herself not just as a Greek queen, but as a true pharaoh, closely linked to the goddess Isis. This mattered deeply in a country where tradition still carried weight. Cleopatra's strategy was not built on romance, despite how later stories would frame it. It was built on survival. Egypt's independence depended on navigating Roman politics carefully. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were political decisions first. Roman sources describe these relationships through their own lens, often hostile, shaped by fear of foreign influence and female power. Economic policy was central to Cleopatra's rule. Egypt's grain supply was critical to Rome's stability. Control of that resource gave Cleopatra leverage. She reformed coinage, managed debt, and worked to stabilize internal unrest. These actions rarely appear in popular retellings, but they mattered far more than personal drama. Cleopatra's image suffered after her death. Roman writers, especially those loyal to Octavian, later Augustus, portrayed her as dangerous, manipulative, and decadent. This served a purpose. By framing the conflict as a moral struggle against an exotic queen, Rome justified its conquest. Egyptian sources, limited as they are from this period, tell a quieter story of continuity. In 30 BC, after defeat by Octavian, Cleopatra died, and Egypt became a Roman province. Officially, this marked the end of pharaonic rule. But in practice, Egypt did not disappear. Roman emperors took on pharaonic titles and temples. Priests continued rituals. Hieroglyphs were still carved for centuries. The worship of Isis spread across the Roman world, reaching as far as Britain. Even the Egyptian language survived, evolving into Coptic, written with Greek letters but rooted in ancient speech. Temples remained centers of local life well into the Roman period. What ended was political independence, not identity. This is the quiet truth at the end of Egypt's long timeline. Conquest did not erase it. Foreign rule did not silence it. Egypt adapted, absorbed, and endured. The civilization that began along the Nile before kings ever ruled did not truly end with Cleopatra. It changed form, as it always had.